Hi everyone, thank you for joining us tonight. Welcome to the 1100 odd participants who have joined us for tonight's webinar, and to all of the viewers who are watching the recording. We're so grateful to have you here. MHPN wishes to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia upon which our webinar presenters and participants are located. We wish to pay respect to the elders past, present and future for the memories, the traditions, the culture and hopes of Indigenous Australia. And I'd just like to take this moment to invite you to share in the chat box which land you're tuning in from this evening. Hi, my name is Jacquie Lee and I'll be facilitating tonight's session. I've been with Emerging Minds for over 3 years now, working as a digital publisher and an editor with the communications team. So my role here involves liaising with our authors to produce engaging, accessible, innovative and evidence-based content across a variety of mediums, and requires a comprehensive knowledge of issues and support strategies related to infant and child mental health. And one of my recent projects has actually been our suite of practice strategies courses, which aligns with this webinar. So I'm really looking forward to diving further into this topic with you all tonight. Next slide, thanks guys. Thanks. So welcome to the 5th webinar in our 4th series with MHPN. We've got our final webinar in our series coming up, which will be Building Parents' Understanding of Play to Promote Infant Mental Health on the 15th of June. And we've got some great topics planned for our 5th series later in the year too. So if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the Emerging Minds newsletter via our website to be the first to hear. So you can do that at www.emergingminds.com.au. Thank you. Next slide. So tonight, each of our panellists will give a short presentation, followed by a question and answer session with the whole panel. You can submit your questions at any time throughout the presentation. And you would have seen the learning outcomes when you registered. So again, I won't run through them now, but you can review them at any time by clicking on that same information icon in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Next slide. So instead, I'll introduce you to tonight's panellists. You would have received a copy of everyone's bios when you registered, so we'll skip over those and we'll get straight into it. First off, I'd like to introduce Emmy, our child and family partner. Hi Emmy, thank you for joining us.
Hi, pleased to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. So Emmy, as a child and family partner, what strategies have you found work well for you and your family?
Goodness, I think just authenticity, just being ourselves and our authentic selves. That really is the best overall strategy that I try to bring to everything that I do, and that I think I've taught my kids to do as well.
Fantastic, thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Penny, our clinical psychologist. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, nice to be here.
Penny, how do you see your role as a psychologist when you're working with kids?
My role, I mean, I think talking about role is a really important thing whenever I work with kids and families, because I think everyone works a bit differently. So I do talk about my role, but I also help families and kids think about what their role is. So I might comment on both of those if that's okay. So I guess with kids, I want them to know obviously that this is all about them. I want them to know that it's their life, their best life. They're going to be the ones doing the work. So I guess sometimes I call them the team captain. So, you know, in our case study, team captain would be, you know, we'd be all on team Zoe. But it's equally important, I think, for everyone to remember that the parent and carer has a really important role. And so I like to set them up as the boss or the head coach, because they're the expert in their child's life. And then I guess my role within that, I think, is to be a bit of a guide. So I think I like to think of myself as the holding environment. So it's my job to act as that safe space and send the message that I've got you. I'll keep you safe, and I'm going to kind of guide you, because it's my role, just like it's the parent's role in their child's life, it's my role to be that security that they can spring off from, and try new things, and, you know, create that safe space that they can come back to and reset and debrief when everything kind of gets tricky or hard. So they're the roles I kind of try and establish in therapy.
Yeah, fantastic. That sounds like a really great way to kind of encourage and establish agency in both children and parents from the get-go as well. Cool. Thank you. And finally, we've got Kate Headley joining us over the phone, battling through internet connection issues. Thank you so much for joining us, Kate. How are you going?
Oh, thank you, Jackie. Yes, apologies everyone for the East Coast low. Rain bomb is playing up with my internet, so we'll see how we go. Cool. I'm really excited for tonight. Yeah.
Thank you. We're so excited to have you. So Kate, I wondered how the engagement strategies that you'll be sharing with us tonight have benefited you in your own practice.
Look, I think one of my learnings across my career has been that actually we can be really intentional around engagement strategies. And I think that's really important for people to think about, because I remember times as a clinician thinking, that clinician always has such great work with people, and they connect really well. And what I've been able to learn is that actually there is intentionality behind how we engage with children and families. And so hopefully, and I'm sure we will showcase some of those concepts and strategies that we can then intentionally build into our clinical practice.
Yeah, fantastic. We've got a lot to look forward to tonight. So tonight's webinar, as Penny mentioned, focuses on the case study of Zoe and her mother Bridget. Bridget has taken Zoe to see a psychologist because she's concerned about her increasing refusal to go to school. You can find a copy of the case study under the information icon if you don't have it handy and want to refer back to it. But now I would like to invite Emmy to kick off tonight's presentations.
Thank you. Thanks. I'd like to give my perspective as a parent and family partner. As a parent, I know that my child is so much more than the problem that we may be presenting with to a clinician. So I would want a clinician to learn a little more about my child and my family. And so not just the tricky stuff that brought us there, but the other stuff behind us, you know, our kind of our whole self kind of thing. So what's fun, what gets my children smiling, who's in the family, a little bit of a family tree. So these kind of questions tell my children that they're more than a problem, or they're more than their the reason they're there, and that they're a whole child, a whole self, and that they matter for who they are. Thank you. Next slide. So when I've been to seek help for my kids, I'm always quite nervous. So I'm thinking about how best to present myself to the person that I'm seeing. I'm worrying about whether I'm going to be judged. Perhaps I might be worried that I might be judged negatively or misunderstood. So I've got all this stuff going on in my head. So I think just at the offset, acknowledging that this is something that really would occur. It occurs with me, and I'm sure it would occur with other people too. So I think, you know, kind of acknowledging that at the at the front will kind of help relax things quite a bit. And I think one of the ways to help work through these anxious feelings are to be curious in your questioning, and talk about, ask about questions which aren't directly related to the issue. So again, that kind of whole self idea of things. And then be compassionate and listen. It doesn't have to be solved all at once, and it's okay to be silly and to laugh. It really is. Jokes are fine. Having a set of dad jokes is really good. Everyone loves dad jokes, including kids. So yeah, just have fun, make silly jokes. Even in tricky situations, having fun is fine, you know, in the right context. And be curious and definitely make time. Next slide, thank you. So kids know what they need. Families have a lot of great solutions that they're already using. Some they might know, some they might be doing without even being aware. So they're doing these unconscious things that are actually helping their situation and their strategies that they've put in place. So I think helping the family to actually identify the strategies that they're already using is really good. So having conversations around that, highlighting it with the family. So, you know, that kind of gives them an idea that they've got all these strengths already which they bring into the room. And one of the ways of doing this is maybe having a whiteboard and getting people to add to that and kind of grow that conversation. And it kind of helps the family to feel empowered and, you know, to go out of the room feeling stronger. Thank you. Next slide. The family is part of this too. Parents are a part of their children's lives, so it's sensible to acknowledge this. You can't take the parent or the caregiver out of the equation, good or bad, they're there. So I think in early interventions or assessment processes, I'd want to be involved in some way in what's happening with my child. I would understand that I can't necessarily be involved in every aspect, but I still want to be involved in some way and have that involvement acknowledged. In the example we're using tonight, it seems like Zoe's family is already very fractured and they're really feeling that fractured nature of their lives. So I think talking about ways that the parents, especially dad, can be involved in some way would be really helpful. You know, maybe Zoe could work on a booklet that she could then share with her dad, or do some drawings that she could sit down and talk about with her dad, to kind of prompt her into conversation so he can be a part of that process even if he's not in the room. Next slide, please. So just a summary and some takeaways. I think it's really important. Take your time. The things can't be fixed at once. Even if a family wants everything fixed at once, sometimes they just need to be gently reminded that things can't be fixed at once, and that's good. You know, that's actually, you'd come out feeling better knowing that things are going to take their time. Listen and be curious, ask lots of questions and have fun. It's okay to be silly. Even in serious matters, sometimes silliness can help remove the anxiety. And families are resourceful. Find out what the family is doing already, strategies that are working, who's supporting them, what they do when things are really tough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emmy. That was fantastic. So many brilliant points there. I think the one that struck me the most was your point about helping the family to uncover all of the strategies that they're already using as a kind of a great first way to help them to feel empowered, as you said, particularly, I guess, if you've got a family in front of you who is feeling quite distressed or despondent or anything like that. Yeah. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yep.
Penny, your turn next.
So next slide, I think. So look, I already spoke in the introduction about my role and how I work with kids and families, so I'm not going to go through all of these dot points, but I think as Emmy said, kids and families don't always know what to expect, and there can be that level of anxiety, understandably, when people come to therapy. And that might be for a few reasons. Like in Zoe's case, it might be because she's new to therapy, but in other cases it might be because they've got so many therapists and everybody works slightly differently. So I think it's really important to engagement that we are thinking about managing and supporting that anxiety by setting up therapy roles and expectations really well right from the outset. So in my experience, it's really worth taking the time to do that, taking the time to make sure that everyone knows why they're coming, what they're working on, how we're going to work on it, why we're working on it, who and how it will look when everybody's involved and how we might involve them, what's going to be most helpful in the therapy space and outside of the therapy space, and really just having conversations about all of these sort of dot-pointed types of, I think, really important therapy expectations. Now, obviously, we're not having that necessarily all at the first session, but I think it's really important to have those really early in therapy and to keep repeatedly having these conversations and sort of gauge where the goalposts are as therapy progresses. So continuing to repeat those over time. I think in setting up those expectations, it really is important to have that sense that therapists are guides, but it has to be guided in a really collaborative way. This idea that everybody is involved in this process, so we really need to establish that attitude of teamwork. I always like to give the message that even though I'm the psychologist, and even though psychologists are assumed to, I don't read minds, and I don't know everything. In fact, I'm just learning as well. And so since there are a million different, I think, wonderful ways to live life and solve problems and be a kid and be a parent and work as a family, what we really need here is for kids and parents and the whole family to be really open and honest with me as well about what they need, but also about what works and what doesn't work. So I really want to establish that collaboration right from the beginning. And then that sense of we'll keep tweaking things. I like to talk to everyone about how therapy really is just like a big experiment, and we're going to try things based on, the research and based on some things that I know, but also based on what we all think might help. And we're going to test it out in real life, and then we'll come back and we'll decide, does that work well? If it did, let's keep it. If it didn't, let's throw it out and come up with a new plan. But at the end of the day, we're all going to make sense of this together. So next slide, please. A second thing I like to think about in engagement is this idea that I'm working with a wise child, not a mini adult. And I think that's where when Emmy mentioned fun and silliness, I think that's so great that that's how families experiencing it as well, because we know that the work of kids is play. And I think anyone working with kids needs to work on their way of interacting with kids and families in that way. And I think it's best captured by Dan Hughes's PACE model. So this idea of always trying to find ways to be playful, accepting, curious and empathic. But I think that authenticity that Emmy mentioned is so important too. So I'm naturally silly. I'm quite loud. I'm quite playful. So silliness really works for me. I find that really easy. But I do know, and I work with some really earnest, some really serious, some quite quiet or gently playful clinicians. And I think that works really well for their families that they work with, because it is about being their authentic selves as well. So I think my tip is find your way of being playful and engaged. And if you're respectful, you don't talk down, you don't use jargon, and you're authentically playful, then that's going to work. It's going to work for the kids, and it's going to work to engage people. And I think the other part of that is remembering that kids aren't mini adults, but they are wise. So we're not just simplifying or dumbing down adult questions and strategies to work with kids. We're genuinely trying to gauge their developmental level. And we're trying to work out where are the kids at in their emotional understanding, their communication skills, their physical skills, their focus, their ability to engage, and their regulation skills, etc. And then we need to really target what we're doing and building up those skills from the bottom up with adult support from where they are. Next slide, please. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I know Kate's actually going to expand on this idea, but I think it is really important to get details when doing assessment, and because kids have those developing skills, I think we really need to adapt those approaches so that we're asking for details in a way that make it easy for kids and parents to answer. So I like to use things like closed choice, so is it like this or something else? And I also like things like sliding scales. So for Zoe, I might say something like, at school on a scale of 0 to 10, how worried do you feel? How happy do you feel? How left out do you feel? How stressed out do you feel? And sort of getting a sense of where she fits on a sliding scale of feelings or some other criteria. And I also might try and gamify things or build in a fun or imaginative activity around getting details. And that's really going to help reduce shame and that social desirability bias, because kids are just talking and they're relaxed. So again, for Zoe, I want, of course, to know the details about what's going on at school, for better or worse. And with her, I might do an activity like, let's design the best school in the world. You know, it's the greatest school on earth competition. Let's design it. What would you do? I actually did this activity with a client just the other day, and what he came up with was that his classroom would have a volume meter, that when things got too loud, the best classroom in the world would have a volume control that he could turn down. So without even asking, I learned some really useful information about one of the things that was really hard for him in school. Next slide, please. Fourthly, I guess it's just important to remember that doing therapy, being in therapy, the work of therapy can be hard a lot of the time. You know, kids and families are there because something isn't going so well. So in order to help kids engage and really get into the work, I think we really need to find and really focus on their motivation. This idea of what would make this work, which will sometimes be boring, can't always be fun, and will sometimes be hard. What's going to make it worth it? What's in it for the kids? What do they really care about deep in their hearts? What's going to make this family and child really connect with and feel motivated to work for? And so I might do that in a whole bunch of ways. I might do values work. I might identify strengths in playful ways by, identifying superhero powers or doing a strength card sort. Or really I'm trying to get at, if you weren't here talking to some boring lady about feelings, what would you choose to be doing instead? I like the activity of, if it was your birthday and it had to be, nearby, so it had to be realistic, you can't fly to Disneyland, but if you were going to be in your neighbourhood with your resources, but you got to dictate everything you got to do for the day, what would that day look like to you? And if a kid says, I want to stay in bed all day, then I'm going to work from there. So yeah, just remembering that, fun ways to get those motivational points. And fun ways for parents to do it too, looking for their hopes and dreams and good intent. And finally, my last slide, I think my goal ultimately is to really work with kids and parents to make sense of what's going on for them. And I really want my therapy relationship to be one in which we all accept that kids do well when they can. And parents do well when they can. And if we all work together, then we can work on what's getting in the way of them being the kid or the parent or the family that they really want to be. So it's my job to discover, what do they need? What do they need to learn or practice or understand or be supported with, so that they can find new ways of living their best life possible, given that there is some tough stuff getting in the way or some developing skills getting in the way. And I really just want to normalise the fact that everyone struggles. I want to normalise pain and challenge. So at the end of the day, my take-home message is, if I were you and I had your history and skills and supports and challenges, then I would probably be doing or thinking or saying or acting just like you are. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I make mistakes too. All humans do. Your mum does, your dad does, adults do. But together we're going to find more effective ways of doing things, are you ready, let's go kind of thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny. That was sensational, and I love how you kind of brought it full circle at the end there, talking about how together as a team and with those team roles you're really uncovering how everyone can do well to find their way to their best life. I had a train of thought and then I lost it. Kate, I'd like to invite you to close off our presentations tonight.
Oh, thank you. And I apologise again that I'm not live on the screen. I guess the only silver lining is my profile picture's about 2 years old, so I can just feel a bit younger for the next few minutes. So in thinking about engagement strategies from my work as a speech pathologist, I completely agree and would like to reinforce, so much of what Emmy and Penny have already spoken about. And I also would always start with trying to talk to expectations, roles and responsibilities early in our engagement. After that though, because I know Penny's spoken to that, one of my starting points is usually always talking to the child and their family about their daily routines. And I find this a really great place to start with families because firstly, it's often not a stressful conversation for families. And we've heard Emmy share with us the worries and concerns and fear of judgment that she may be bringing to the interaction. We also know that research tells us that children enter their interactions with adults with the expectation that adults already know stuff about them. And so I'm trying to find a topic that positions myself as naive and the child and their family as the position of expert in that interaction. And I don't know their daily routine and I don't know the activities of their week. So this lends itself really well to that dynamic. And from this conversation, and that's what it is a conversation. So it's not peppered with direct questioning, there's no right or wrong, and it just opens up a wealth of information. So I learn about the child's different environments, who they have different relationships with, activities that they're doing, but I also hear through that conversation about their strengths and their interests. I'll hear what's working, what doesn't seem to be working, and I think it just creates a great point for engagement that brings up in that conversational tone things that we can come back to later in our therapeutic engagement. Next slide, please. So for me, obviously, as a speech pathologist, my mind always goes to visually supporting conversations. And so I do try and always build in some ways for doing and showing as a way of sharing information than it always needing to be talking through information. Now, that can be really developmentally appropriate for children. It can be really supportive of children who have language difficulties. But I think we can all reflect on the fact that sometimes talking is difficult when we're experiencing intense emotion and when we don't know the people we're talking to very well. So I will often use activities such as sorting pictures or sorting written words. I use lots of visual scales. I'll use drawing or photography or even colour coding as strategies to allow the child to give information in a way that might feel a bit more accessible. Next slide, please. And then I will bring those visual support strategies along in the process of engagement. And I think it's really important that we provide child-friendly ways to enable the child we're working with to prioritise what is meaningful and important to them. So there are heaps of informal methods for doing this, but there's also some formal tools across the different disciplines that do this as well. And I recently was reflecting just last week, actually undertook this task with a child, and it was immensely engaging for this child who does have significant communication supports, but she was able to, across a scale of really easy through to really hard, place different communication activities on that scale. And then really importantly, when I asked her if I could make one of these activities easier today, out of all of these activities, which one would you want me to make easier today? She was able to very clearly find the representation of the activity that she wanted to prioritise. It was hugely powerful learning. Next slide, please. And then, you know, as Penny alluded to, it's really important that we're able to delve down into problems that people identify and pull out lots of information about that. Because in mine, and I'm imagining many of your experiences, rarely are behavioural difficulties ever as clear-cut as many family members might perceive them. And delving into the detail of the difficulties can help to be a great way to start, you know, fresh understandings for people around the child, around what might be happening for that child and why a task might be difficult. So, for example, in Zoe's case, in the case study she references feeling dumb at school, in that scenario, I might actually whiteboard her words there. And then as we talk about that, you know, I want to pull out detail about if she feels like that in different classes, when she has interactions with different peers, with different teachers, different events across the day, different family members, times of the day, preceding activities, all that kind of detail. And I can pull that out in showing really genuine curiosity through our conversation. But visually putting that up allows us then to kind of start to fact check some of what I've heard with Zoe, but also to look at if there's any themes or helpful information we can draw together from that conversation. And then the next slide. You know, as Emmy mentioned, children and families do always already have strategies that they have tried and are currently using to help things that problems they're experiencing in their life. And we want to be able to build on those existing strategies. And with intervention and support strategies, we can position ourselves in a coaching framework to mediate that problem solving and trials of support. And I try to make this absolutely as visual as I can, be that in any representation, in a book the person takes with them, with a photo, with a PowerPoint slide, however we want to do it, so that we can continually come back to this as a dynamic problem-solving scientific inquiry approach. We're going to skill up the child and use their experiences to guide what support strategies we're prescribing and supporting them to trial. And that kind of takes me to the end of my slides. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kate. And thank you everyone for your fantastic presentations. We've arrived at the Q&A part of tonight's webinar, so if you haven't already, please submit your question via the speech bubble icon in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. I believe it is, somewhere down there. We've got some fantastic questions coming through already. So first off, I might direct this question first to Penny, but then open it to Kate and Emmy as well, if you'd like. We've obviously talked a lot tonight about engagement and assessment with children because of Zoe in the case study. But how would you apply these strategies to work with infants and toddlers?
Do you want me to speak to that first? I think that it would depend again, like as I referenced, the developmental age and the need and the reason that the infant or toddler were there. But certainly with infants and toddlers, a lot of the work is going to be using that head coach, parent or coach much more, because we know that, it's the system around an infant or toddler that we need to sort of be putting in place strategies and changes. But I do think as well that there is an element of actually really needing to build that connection, even at a developmental age with the baby or even with the toddler, because you are building connection with the whole family system. And so we certainly know that when it comes to work with toddlers, then play is going to be the only work we really do. There's not going to be worksheets and talking therapy. It's going to be, train sets and puppetry. So, you've got to be able to find your play skills. And even working with parents, getting them on the floor and us all playing together is going to be a part of the work, and much more a part of the work, I think. Yeah.
Sure, fantastic. Kate, did you have anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah. I was also thinking then about how the communication, obviously, of infants and toddlers is very different to working with a slightly older child. And so one thing that I have found in working with parents of infants is that sometimes parents are tuning into different communicative behaviour in the infant in different ways. And I think it's really important to make the observations of the interactions between the infant and the child and be able to reinforce the strengths of that relationship. Because when there's differences, I have seen that can be when a parent's bringing lots of concerns and worries to the therapy session or their engagement with me, and saying things like, Dad's the only one that can soothe her. I'm not able to soothe her. Dad's got the skills with that. So wherever the opportunity to arises, to watch those differences but provide feedback on the strength and what might be unique strengths between each parent and the child, can really, really help with parental engagement and empowerment for them to sit in that kind of coach and captain role in that dynamic as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Amy, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Really just what already has been said. The parents and caregivers are the key in this, and they already have a lot of solutions like we've already been talking about. So be looking to their parents or the caregivers.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. While I've got you, Penny sort of spoke to this in her presentation when she was talking about motivation. But I wondered if you had any thoughts about how practitioners could work with parents who are maybe disengaged or feeling a bit defensive. I know you mentioned that you would want to be involved in the therapeutic process, but obviously that's unfortunately not the case every time.
I guess, firstly, part of that authenticity is just acknowledging that that is the case, and maybe even acknowledging that with the parent or the caregiver. And then after that, finding out what's kind of motivating this disengagement or reluctance to be involved, and kind of picking around it a little bit, trying to work out with the person what's going on. Maybe there's been some mistrust in the past, or some traumatic experience with a service provider. So just working out what that is, and then you can work from there.
Fantastic. Thank you. I guess that could probably be applied if the parent is in denial as well. That's a question that's come through in the chat.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm working out why they're being in denial or not able to see the situation for what it is. They might not even know, and it might be helpful to have a conversation around that. So that can be like a scaffolding skill that they could have some assistance with.
Great, thank you. We've had quite a few questions come through about the best ways to engage kids who are super active or perhaps have diagnosed or undiagnosed ADHD. So I might handle that to Penny in the first instance, but again, if, Kate or Emmy, you'd like to add to it as well, please feel free. Yeah.
How to engage them. I think part of it is actually being willing to bring the energy yourself, but also being, I think what Kate was mentioning before about being really intentional about managing the energy in the room. So for some sessions I will be going, this is going to be a really fun session. I'm going to meet the kid where they're at. I'm going to play. I'm going to move between activities quickly, and I'm really going to be focusing on a bit of informal assessment of where they're at and how quickly they move, but also just really bringing the fun and bringing the connection so they can just be their sort of authentic selves in that space, and I'm meeting them where they're at. But other times when I suppose I need to be bringing focus or really wanting to have their best version of attentiveness, or for them to really hone in, then I might be being more intentional about finding out from parents what their best environment is to get the best focus I can get, or I might be adding routine and structure so it's like a bit of high energy play and then seeing if I can bring it down and having some focus. But I think also I would be sort of probably using visuals to sort of structure that if consistently the session is quite high energy, to have a, your activity, my activity, your activity kind of approach, knowing that routines and structure around that can really sort of help with some of that high energy, and taking a Barocca before I have some of those sessions. So,
yeah, sure. I imagine those kinds of approaches would be particularly important if you're trying to administer, an intelligence test or something like that is quite structured and takes a fair time to get through.
Yeah, so being willing to stop and start when you're going to be getting the best version of a kid, I think, when we're doing assessments is sometimes really hard to do in the environments that assessments are set. I mean, I don't actually do formalised assessments anymore, but I used to. And certainly one of the frustrations was sometimes the appointment is, you want to get the assessment done in one session or, at very most 2 sessions, when actually probably ideally you'd be doing a few subtests over a series of sessions. Sometimes you've got to work within the systems. But I guess then it's about talking with families and making sure in the writing up of the assessments that, these are the reasons why you think this was a good gauge of where they're really at, whereas this one we didn't think we got the best outcome because engagement wasn't there, or there wasn't enough time to establish rapport, or, they'd reached the end of their ability to stay focused, rather than saying they can't do this, saying in this context we don't think we saw their best skill. Yeah,
fantastic. It always comes back to context, doesn't it?
For sure.
Thank you. Kate, it sounded like you might want to jump in. Did I imagine that?
Oh, I think I was maybe just nodding and making positive noises accidentally while I nodded. But also fine. I really take on Emmy's point that kids often are hugely insightful about what works for them. And we need to not underestimate a child's insight into their difficulties and also what works for them. I'm just reflecting on a fantastic conversation I had with a young teenager a couple of days ago where, he has difficulties with attention. However, we needed to complete some formal assessment, and I was able to engage him in the conversation, explain what the task would look like. He was motivated for the why, which is the important part, and together we came up with a strategy for how we were going to get through these somewhat laborious, boring tasks. And he was a really active part of that plan. So I think harder, of course, with younger children, but even choices for younger children to actively engage them in the planning of how you're going to get those things done and help them understand the why, the what's in it for me.
Of course. Thank you. Our next question sort of follows on nicely from this. It's about time constraints. So How could a practitioner modify the strategies that you've talked about tonight to fit within time constraints that are outside of the practitioner's control or the family's control? Say, if there's a limited number of sessions, or if you're perhaps only working in a holding role with this particular child and family until they go into more longer term support. Can you think of any ways in which the strategies we've talked about tonight could be modified to suit? Sorry.
Well, the first thing that comes,
thank you.
Yeah. That's all right. The first thing that comes to my mind is prioritisation. So, you know, that absolute transparency from the get-go of what the constraints are on the service you can offer, and then, you know, empowering the child and their family as to, in knowing this information, how would you best like to use my support and service? And obviously scaffolding the choices and options for that as much as possible. But we've all had that experience as clinicians, and sometimes that can be a successful engagement as long as everyone's coming into that with like informed decision making. What's on the table? How long is this for? So how are we going to best use this time together?
Sure. Thank you. Did anyone want to add to that?
I guess something that I would probably add to that is, yes, I would certainly be identifying like the piece of work is sometimes how I like to word it, like the piece of work that we're going to be able to do with the time we have together. But at the same time, for me, I think if we have limited time, I always say that my very first session with a client anyway, my overarching therapeutic goal is to get them to come back for the second session. But I think in the case of a time-limited service or a brief intervention, the reason my goal in the first session is to get them to come back is because I feel like one of the first and most valuable pieces of work any service can provide is for a family or a child to walk out going, even though I'm not going to see that person again, I have an experience of that person was kind, that person heard me, that person felt me or saw me, and it would be safe or it would be okay to maybe ask for help again. And so even if we're just giving that experience, I think in a brief service, sometimes it is just about there are places that I could go where people might be okay to get help from, and that I think is part of the longer term journey in a child's kind of support, and we can do that even in brief ways.
Great. Thank you. Sorry, before I go to the next question, Emmy, did you have anything you'd like to add?
I was just thinking, well, everything that's been said already, but in addition, perhaps guiding on next steps. So the family might already know where they're going, so maybe guiding on conversations or how to work with the next person.
Fantastic. We've had a few questions come through in regards to trauma. So again, I'll throw to the panel. How can practitioners best engage children and parents who have experienced trauma, in particular, without re-traumatizing them in the process?
I could answer to that at the initial. I think part of the issues around trauma is that it can get in the way of communication and thought processes. So I guess finding out the kind of the touch points of where you can and can't go in talking about traumatic or difficult aspects, and also having as much of a person's story already known, so maybe written down or passed on from another service, so that there's a little amount of retelling that the family has to do.
Great. Thank you. Sorry, anyone else?
I could add some to that, and I think that that's such an important thing, is that personalisation, is that everybody's story is going to be their own, and you know, taking that lead from the child and family. But I think whenever I think of sort of trauma work and how to sort of tread carefully around it, I think, is I think of the image that Kent Hoffman, who's one of the 4, you know, developers of Circle of Security, who's one of my gurus, and Kent Hoffman talks about trauma and big feelings as a black hole, and this idea that what happens is that when you're falling into trauma, or when you get triggered and you've had trauma, or when you even get triggered by a really big feeling, that it feels like falling into this black hole where you're all alone and it spins forever and you're lost and it's dark and you're all and it will never ever end. And that part of our job as therapists is to sort of support clients to know that there are ways in and out of the black hole, and that the black hole isn't actually bottomless and endless. And so I sort of think about my role, and that comes back to that holding environment, as before I'm going too close to diving, you know, we're not doing a deep dive into the black hole. We might be like peering over the edge or dipping our toe in, but developing before we go there some strategies, like uniquely individualised strategies, which the child can often guide me in, or that families have already tried some things that does help them bring themselves out if it's too much. And we might even really spend a few sessions dabbling or playing with or talking about what does help them come back to themselves, and actually practicing them, so I'm really familiar with what I could do to help, so that I can be like the person who holds the rope while they lean over the edge, and then that, you know, we can all pull back together if we need to. So that's how I might sort of establish that work.
Yeah, that's such a great metaphor.
So beautiful. I'm like the
And
bungee rope. You can bounce back out again.
In addition to all of those things, and obviously it's really, there's lots to consider in working with people who've experienced complex trauma, but my mind always, in thinking about engagement, goes to what can I do as a practitioner to create as strong a sense of psychological safety from the get-go as possible. And so I will often try and send information to the child and the family prior to the appointment that can outline their some information about what to expect in that appointment, what they can expect from me, what they can expect from the environment they're in. For children, I'll often do that with some photos, or maybe I'll send them a little introductory video just on mum or dad's phone so that they've seen me before. I'm giving some good interpersonal feedback that I'm a warm and friendly face, and trying to structure some routine into those initial couple of appointments, just to try and embed as much psychological safety as possible, to help with that initial engagement and trust developing.
Fantastic, thank you. Kate, I'll throw it back to you with this one. You mentioned in your presentation that you found that particular scale worked well with a child who needed significant communication support. But can you offer any considerations and other strategies for engaging children with disability and with communication difficulty, particularly in assessments, I guess?
Yeah, so I think clinicians of all disciplines need to really obviously get a lot of good information about a child's communication skills as part of their initial engagement. And this is probably, even more vital in the case of more complex disabilities and when a child might have a complex communication need. And what I always recommend to, my colleagues in these scenarios, collect the information from the people who are going to know best, and that's nearly always the family and the people the child lives with. And it may well be that as a clinician, you can resource yourself up to be able to meet the child's communication skills and support. So it may be that, with the use of some visual tools, with the use of some keyword sign, with the use of, modifying the length and complexity of how you speak to the child, that you can meet the child's communication support needs. However, if it's a scenario where maybe the child's using some high-tech augmentative or alternative communication, or it's they might be using Auslan as their primary mode of communication and you don't speak Auslan, then in those scenarios I would recommend working out who's going to be the communication partner for this child in your work with that child. And so that may be a caregiver, it may be someone in a school context, it may be a sibling. Like, there will be someone in that child's life who actually has real expertise in that child's communication. And then part of your work is going to be around setting up some boundaries with that communication partner so that we're still genuinely hearing the child's voice and the child is actively got agency and control, but they've got these, conduits for the communication barriers that, might exist between you and that child. And then I guess in terms of assessment, one thing that I feel really strongly about is that we need to be the best advocates that we can for children, which means that in terms of funding bodies, we need to advocate for the appropriate use of assessment tools. And sometimes there can be pressure to use a formalised assessment tool whose psychometrics don't apply to the child that we're working with. And in those cases, in my practice, I always try to use the most appropriate assessment tool that is going to recognise both this child's strengths and support needs, but look at it in terms of their functional use of communication across their everyday environments. Now, sometimes I might use formal assessment methods in combination with informal methods, but often I'm actually having to use more function-based assessments and then, justifying in reports why those assessment methods were chosen and why alternative known formal assessment tools weren't chosen.
Great, thank you. We've got a question here about who you would include in the family session. So in what way and at what points would a practitioner include someone outside of the immediate family unit, like perhaps grandparents or siblings or other children in the child's life? Penny, would you be open to answering that?
Yes, I think the answer would be depends on what they're there to work on and how relevant it was and how useful it was to involve as many people as possible. Sometimes the work can be done, I would say the work can never be done very well without at least one key adult who is going to be following up on things with people. So that doesn't always have to be a parent. It might, or a carer. In cases where kids are in rotational care, for example, it's very hard to identify who that adult is. But so I think there's always the need for an adult, safe person who works with you and works with the child to help them put things in place in the real world outside of therapy, and is responsible for helping get them there and follow through. But when it comes to extending out, I think I'd be leaving that probably in the court of what's going to make the biggest difference to the young person, and also, trusting to the wisdom of their family about who needs to be involved or not. It does get complex when maybe two parents or two key people disagree on who would like to be or who needs to be involved, or even if the child and the parent disagree on who the important players are. So again, it comes down to that teamwork, that back and forth collaborative, respectful conversation and going, if this is the goal and we think these are the people who need to be part of it for the change to really happen, how can we do that in a way that's going to feel safe, going to feel respectful and going to have all the key players? I mean, we like to use that team metaphor even. It's like, sometimes you just need a head coach, but sometimes we need a manager and a head coach and like a co-coach and who are all the people on Team Zoe going to be without it being ridiculous and with it being within like the world that works well for Zoe at the end of the day.
Yeah, I guess perhaps then that becomes the responsibility of the head coach to sort of recruit those other players for the team outside of your sessions. Yeah.
As long as you don't have two warring head coaches, which can make it all very complex.
Well, we've had a couple of questions around that as well, around engaging with children from broken families, or in cases where one of the parents is quite engaged in the therapeutic process and the other one either is disengaged or sort of quite vehemently against it. Can I ask how you might tackle a situation like that?
I could do a 3-hour lecture on how I would, in fact I have done a 3-hour talk on working with separated families and I didn't have enough time. So in short, I guess my first point is safety first, and sometimes that's easier said than done because two people's viewpoints can make a clinician uncertain about what is safe and what's not, and it's not really our job to decide. So establishing how we can ideally promote as much safety for everybody involved, and that's obviously physical, emotional safety, but even just like the sacred space of therapy being a safe space. So it is just about getting all the information. So safety first, and secondly, I think the way I would work is that wherever possible and safe to do so, as many or all of the members of the parenting team that can be involved, we would be establishing who and when and how they can be appropriately involved as possible, and that's about, I think, a lot of transparent upfront communication and about really establishing what confidentiality would look like for all of the parties, obviously getting any legal documents and orders and intervention orders and having all of that safety information. And I think finally it is a little bit about being brave as a clinician, because I'm passionate about working with separated families, and I think it's the hardest place to sit, because you often do have to sit working with two parents who disagree but often really actually do want to be the best parents they can possibly be, and their conflict with each other makes it very difficult for the young person's needs to be upheld, and yet everybody in this system really does just want to have better connections, and so it can be very uncomfortable as a clinician, I think, working in this space. But if we can be a little bit brave and we can be really respectful, then even though sometimes we become the target of the frustration and anger, stepping in that space and sitting in the grey and going, I don't know that this is 100% the right way to do this or the wrong way, but I'm just going to keep reaching out to everybody and trying to bring this child to the front and centre in all of that. Is my kind of concise answer.
That's great. I feel like we should make note of that for a future webinar. Awesome. Emmy or Kate, did you have anything you wanted to add to that particularly thorny question?
Oh, it's a tricky one. I think, like Penny said, safety first and boundaries, working out what the boundaries are inside the rooms and outside of the rooms, and how and why they are like that and how to maintain them. But it is complicated and unique to each situation, I would think. That
was much more concise, Emmy, and I got right to the heart of the matter. I agree.
And at a very practical level, just to build on what you've both said with boundaries, sometimes I've been involved in work with teams where with families we are actually putting those boundaries visually in the room during therapy sessions. And so we are all in a very concrete, shared understanding space, and when a boundary is overstepped, we can just have an agreed signal. We can draw our attention back to that boundary that's clearly displayed on the wall, and we've got an agreement that when that happens, we need to move on. Yeah. So obviously it takes a lot of work to get there and a lot of commitment from parents to be able to do that, but sometimes visualising what we've talked about can help reinforce that as well.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you. we've had a few questions come through around working with parents with mental health issues that might be impacting on the child, but also just more generally how you could engage with parents around something that they are doing or something about them that is impacting negatively on the child, but without shaming them or making them feel defensive. Perhaps, Emmy, would you be willing to speak to that from a child and family partner perspective?
Yeah, I think in terms of the first aspect, parents with a mental health condition, I think acknowledging that already probably the child is assisting their parent in some way, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, and working out what that looks like, and kind of going from there. But beyond that, I can't really talk too much more, but I think that will be a good starting point, because it would be a common thing, I would think. And the other aspect, yeah, that can be tricky, because I think particularly parents that are in traumatic or difficult, challenging situations can fall into patterns that they might not normally be in, of negative behaviours or negative viewpoints. It just kind of can cloud everything. So I think it was talked about earlier about parents want to be their best, and I think sometimes parents might need a little bit of a hand in how to be their best, and just doing that gently and openly. I think openness is really important. If you have an open space, it's very difficult to get shame in there, yeah, just kind of being upfront. I think when you're trying to be really careful and just kind of too careful, that in itself can become shaming. So I think just openness, authenticity, and upfront, and modelling, and just allowing the parent to gently be highlighted into what they're doing and how it may not be good for that child.
Thank you. That's such a fantastic point about not dancing around the issue, because then you kind of suggest in what you're not saying that there is something to be ashamed about.
Absolutely.
There are so many fantastic questions, and we're unfortunately coming to the end. There's one last one I wanted to quickly ask, which is going back to trauma. As a therapist, so this person says, as a therapist in an organisation, I see my role as creating a safe environment and giving some protection for the child. What would you say, or how would you provide a message to people who are demanding a particular outcome, perhaps wanting the child to be fixed, or another kind of outcome? Penny, I can see you first on my screen.
Oh dear, and my face was going, oh, that's a very tricky question. How would I respond to therapists who think we need to be fixing the kid? That, I think, coming right back to Emmy's very first point, that it's like there is no rushing this process, and that this is about us all coming to a shared understanding about the way this child and this family's best life will unpack. And I think it comes down to, as therapists ourselves, we need to be constantly reflecting on our own judgments, our own values, our own stuff that's getting in the way, and our organisation's judgments and values and stances and priorities, and questioning how do we put that to one side, or make it part of the conceptualisation of the picture, but certainly coming back to what is going to lead to this child feeling like throughout their lives they can get help, and right now what is going to be their best life. So yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I know I put you completely on the spot there.
It's okay. I did say, put me on the spot, that'll be fine.
No famous last words. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone who's submitted questions for tonight. I think we could probably go for another hour at least to answer all of the wonderful questions that you've sent through. So sorry if we didn't get to yours, but I hope you found this session helpful nonetheless. Next slide, please. So you can download tonight's presentation, slides, case study, and some suggested links from all of our panellists by clicking on the information icon in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Please ensure that you complete the feedback survey before you log out tonight by clicking on the yellow speech bubble icon. We really value your feedback. It helps us to ensure that we are giving you the kinds of webinars that you want and that we're continuing to improve with every session. Statements of attendance for this webinar will be issued in about 4 weeks, and you will receive a link to the recording of the webinar and the associated online resources within around 4 to 6 weeks as well. We've seen a lot of questions come through in the chat tonight about suggestions for particular engagement tools. So we'll chat to our presenters after tonight's webinar and see if we can get some links for those into that email for you too. Next slide. As I mentioned, you can find supporting resources by clicking on the information icon. You can find more information about Emerging Minds at www.emergingminds.com.au, and you can actually find our suite of practice strategies courses which feature Zoe and Bridget and her family on our website as well. If you head to the online training section, it's free to sign up. And our next webinar, as we mentioned, is Building Parents' Understanding of Play to Promote Infant Mental Health on the 15th of June. And we've got a couple of MHPN webinars coming up as well in May. Next slide. Thank you. Just a few words quickly about the partnership between MHPN and Emerging Minds. So this webinar was co-produced by MHPN and Emerging Minds for the Emerging Minds National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health project. The National Workforce Centre is funded by the Australian Government Department of Health under the National Support for Child and Youth Mental Health Program. Next slide. If you'd like to continue collaborating with local practitioners, MHPN has over 350 networks around Australia, as well as a whole bunch of online networks. Project officers are available to help connect you to interdisciplinary networks across metropolitan, regional, rural and remote Australia, either face-to-face or online. If you're interested in joining or starting a network, please visit our online map or contact Jacquie O'Loughlin at networks@mhpn.org.au. And finally, before I close tonight's webinar, I'd like to acknowledge the consumers and the carers who have lived with mental health difficulties in the past and those who continue to live with mental health difficulties in the present. Thank you to everyone for participating this evening. Thank you so much to all of our incredible panellists for gifting us with your wisdom and joyful presence. And we look forward to seeing you at a webinar in the future. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.